Okay, well, thank you very much, Hannah. And thank you all for joining me. It's great to be back on Lockdown University. Please forgive my slightly croaky voice. My subject today is forced conversions under Islam. Now, the Quran actually forbids forced conversion. The Quran forbids forced conversion. But as we shall see, Jews from Timbuktu to Tashkent did convert to Islam. And these are just some of the recorded episodes in history. And they occurred under both Shia Islam and Sunni Islam. Jews and Christians were permitted to practice their religion as monotheistic people of the book, but they were dhimmis, and that is inferior to Muslims. They were forced to pay tribute, the jizya, a special poll tax, in return for the ruler's protection. They also had to abide by a whole host of restrictions and humiliations for failing to convert to the ultimate religion. For instance, they could not build churches or synagogues higher than mosques. They had to ride donkeys and not horses, a noble animal. They did not have the same legal rights as Muslims, and so on. And they had to wear distinguishing clothing. Uh, Note the ill-fitting black garb worn by this Jew from Morocco. According to the hadith, that is the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad transmitted and interpreted by various scholars, there is no compulsion in religion. In fact, Muslims do not talk about conversion, but reversion. Everyone is born Muslim, they believe. Therefore, converts just revert to Islam. And there is this idea that you can't be forced to accept what is self-evident and natural. So Islam began to spread from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. At first, the Arabs were outnumbered by the peoples they had conquered. For the first 400 years, they were more interested in securing their tribute than in converting them. In fact, they had a disincentive to convert Jews, non-Muslims, because they wanted to maintain their tax revenues. After that, there must have been an element of coercion. Otherwise, how do you explain that Islam colonized a vast swathe of territory larger than the Roman Empire, and pagans, Jews, and Christians became dwindling minorities? According to the historian Martin Gilbert, conversion to Islam became a feature of Jewish life under Islam for many generations, whether it was encouraged by Muslim rulers or forced upon dhimmi populations or undertaken willingly. Once a Muslim, always a Muslim. It was like Hotel California. You can never leave for another religion. What was termed apostasy. And apostasy is punishable by death. Apart from in times of war, there were four main reasons for conversion. If you were a Jew or a Christian unable to pay the jizya tax, you converted. In fact, Imam al-Khathir, who who wrote about the verse, "There is no compulsion in religion," added a rider that whoever fails to pay his tax must be fought or killed. The second reason is Jews who were captured as slaves. They might convert if they thought the chances of being ransomed were very small. A third reason was that Muslims got preferential treatment at corn stores at times of drought or famine. Converts also got exclusive inheritance rights over non-converts. This was the case until the end of the 19th century in Persia and Tunisia. The fourth reason was that Jews converted to be accepted, to further their career, or to achieve high social status. For instance, this man here, Aaron Kandin, who was the Bukharan finance minister. The Ottoman Empire had a practice called the devshirme. This involved recruiting young Christian boys, primarily from the Balkans, as a blood tax to serve the Sultan. They would be converted to Islam and trained as soldiers or janissaries, and they would serve as a unique class, loyal only to the Sultan. Some janissaries became rulers themselves, for instance, the Mamluk dynasty. But you might say, what about the Golden Age in Spain? Was this not a time of tolerance between Jews, Christians, and Muslims? Sadly, this is something of a myth. For over 150 years, from 1130 to 1269, southern Spain and North Africa were invaded by fierce Berber Islamic fundamentalists, the Almoravids, in Arabic Almorabitun, and the Almohads, Almuwahidun. The Almohads conquered Fez, Marrakesh, and finally Cordoba in southern Spain, burning Jewish books and destroying synagogues in their wake. Christianity died out altogether in North Africa, and to all intents and purposes, Jews in Morocco converted en masse to Islam rather than be put to death for apostasy. And one of Judaism's greatest scholars, Maimonides, was born in Cordoba in southern Spain in 1159, aged 13. He and his family had to escape persecution by the Almohads, and they fled to Morocco. In 1146, the Moroccan town of Sijil Massa was captured by the Almohads. The Jews were active there in trading gold. The Jews were given the stark choice of conversion or death. This was something of a betrayal, as the inhabitants of Sijil Massa had allied with the Almohad ruler, Abdul Mumin, and delivered the town to him. When he entered the town, he gathered all the Jews together and suggested they convert to Islam. Rabbi Solomon ben Judah wrote about this episode. For 7 months, the Jews had disputations with Abdul Munim, fasting and praying. They refused to renounce their faith, and 150 chose death. But the Jewish leader, Joseph ben Amram, converted. Rabbi Solomon ben Judah was not impressed. "This is why I despair and cry out," he exclaims. The most famous Jewish convert to Islam is thought to have been Maimonides himself. Maimonides fled Cordoba to the royal capital of Morocco, Fez. Initially, the Almohads had not demanded conversion to Islam. Maimonides was thought to have converted to Islam during the 5 years he lived there, but this is disputed. Many people cannot bear the idea that one of Judaism's foremost figures might have converted. Martin Gilbert says he was arrested by the Muslim authorities on charges of relapsing into Judaism, an accusation he escaped because a Muslim friend attested to his good character. This is Maimonides' house in Fez. He was forced to leave for Eretz Israel and Egypt, which was under the more tolerant Fatimids. In Egypt, he reverted to Judaism and became court physician to Saladin himself. Incidentally, the reason why there were Jews in key posts was because the community at large were hostages to these Jews' good behavior. Jews could be trusted not to poison or betray their masters. Otherwise, they risked unleashing a massacre of their co-religionists. Maimonides was a realist and a rationalist. He consoled distraught Jewish converts that they were doing the right thing, with the doctrine that human life is to take precedence over law. The Dayan of Fez, a man called Ibn Susan, declared that Jews who pretend to convert to Islam to save their lives cannot be considered to be Jews anymore. In response, Maimonides composed Ma'amar Kiddush Hashem, the treatise on the sanctification of the name. The head of the Yemenite Jews appealed to Maimonides for guidance on how to face the threat of persecution and forced conversions. Maimonides responded by sending him his famous epistle to Yemen. Quote, "On account of our sins, God has cast us into the midst of this people, the nation of Ishmael, who persecute us severely and devise ways to harm us and debase us," he wrote. He justified formal conversion to Islam as an acceptable alternative to torture and death. He advised his fellow Jews, utter the Shahada, the formula of conversion, and live. He said, whereas Christianity could be interpreted as idol worship, there was nothing in Islam that made Jews who did this contravene Jewish law. Why did Christianity die out in North Africa and Judaism, though much diminished, didn't? Jews maintained Judaism at home. The Muslims made them wear a distinctive mark, the shikla. The Almohad Caliph Yaqub al-Mansur inadvertently helped them survive as Jews by telling them they could only marry each other. But even Jewish converts suffered various disabilities and vexations. They were only allowed to practice certain trades, could not marry off their daughters to real Muslims, had to wear the special headgear and black garments reserved for Jews with absurdly long sleeves and worn off the shoulder. And this custom persisted into the 20th century. Tamantit in Algeria's Touat region, as you can see on the map on the right, was home to a prosperous Jewish community, later joined by Sephardi Jews exiled from Spain. The Jews were active in the caravan trade across the Sahara Desert. However, in the late 15th century, the fanatic Islamic cleric Muhammad al-Marghili incited their destruction. He demolished their synagogue in the fateful year of 1492, forcing survivors to flee south to Timbuktu in present-day Mali and convert. What is fascinating is that some of their descendants in Mali still claim Jewish ancestry. There was even a revival of Jewish identity in the 1990s, and descendants of Jews, who are now mostly Muslims, founded an organization called Zachor to uncover the concealed Jewish history of Mali. Back in Fez, the Marinids succeeded the Almohads. They allowed secret Jews to practice openly once again. However, a fair proportion of converts remained Muslim and moved out of the Jewish quarter, or Melach, for the Medina. A number became successful businessmen with access to the Caesarea, or covered market. They were selling silks and fine fabrics, but their business rivals, the Sharifians, who claimed descent from Muhammad, accused the crypto-Jews of pretending to practice Islam. They were known as the Beldiyin, which means the locals. In 1468, the Sharifian rivals to the Beldiyin forbade Jews and dogs from accessing the precincts of the Shurafa Mosque, which was built to house the body of their ancestor Idris. They had the Beldiyin expelled from the Caesarea. The struggle between the Sharifians and the Beldiyin, whose shops and clothing had to carry distinguishing markings, would last until the 19th century. With every famine, more Jews in Morocco would convert to Islam in order to qualify for tzedakah, the corn reserves held by the religious authority, or Waqf. Gradually, Fez, in the centre of the country and most vulnerable to drought, was emptied of Jews. As late as 1912, when 12,000 Jews were left homeless as a result of a massacre known as the Fez Trittle, still more Jews, in fear of their lives, converted to Islam. The Beldiyin retained business contacts with the Jews of the Melach and subterranean religious links. Thus, they would call on a mohel or rabbi to perform a circumcision. A Bildi bride would receive a perforated piece of wood to encourage her to prepare kosher meat in the traditional style. There could be 100,000 Beldiyin still living in Morocco today, whose facial features and surnames like Zikri, Shukrun, Benzaken, Al-Banani, Miyara, etc., their facial features, their surnames, and their accents and dialects betray their Jewish origins. The community survived largely intact because they married among themselves. Many are prominent in law or Moroccan intellectual life today. Unlike the Mashhadi Jews of Persia or the Chala converts of Bukhara, which we will be talking about shortly, these people remained in or next to their Jewish quarters. Cases of Bildi'in reverting to Judaism are rare. But a quarter of the inhabitants of Fez are thought to have Jewish roots, so much so that their football team is known as the Jews, just as Tottenham Hotspur is known as the Yids, or Ajax in Amsterdam is known as the Super Jews. In Fez, local consciousness of a Jewish past is never very far beneath the surface. Just go and see the Fez team play a football match. Staying in Fez for a moment, we now come to the story of the tragic heroine Sol Hatchwell. She epitomizes the problem at the heart of Islam, which is incapable of tolerating any rival to it. Conversion to Islam is a one-way street. Apostasy from Islam is punishable by death. Sol's case also tells you a lot about Islam's attitude to Jewish women. Sol Hatchwell, also known as Solika, was born in 1817 to Chaim and Simcha Hatchwell in Tangier. She was exceptionally pretty. She was executed in 1834 at the age of 17 for apostasy after her Muslim neighbors testified that she had converted to Islam. There are different versions of her story in different languages. In one version, she fell out with her mother, who had a violent temper, and went to a Muslim nurse who lived nearby. The woman begged her to abjure her faith and embrace Islam, and thus have nothing to do with her mother forevermore. But Sol refused until the woman went to the local Qadi or judge. Sol had embraced Islam of her own free will and was now trying to relapse into Judaism, the woman claimed. Another account states that she fell in love with a Muslim boy who demanded her hand in marriage. The father of the boy threatened her family with bitter suffering if they didn't let her convert to Islam and marry his son. In another account, the Pasha of Tangier himself promised to marry her if she converted to Islam. Sol was sent for trial in Fez, but was adamant that she would not renounce her Judaism. But she was not going to get a fair hearing. The testimony of a Muslim trumps that of a Jew. One of the Sultan's sons caught sight of the beautiful Jewess and wished to acquire her for his harem. One account says, "Never had the sun of Africa shone on more perfect beauty. It is a sin that such a pearl should be in the possession of the Jews, and it would be a crime to leave them such a jewel." But Sol would not recant, and the judge would not revoke the death sentence. She responded, "I will patiently bear the weight of your chains. I will give my limbs to be torn apart piecemeal by wild beasts. I will renounce forever the light of day." Her parents made a fruitless appeal to the Spanish vice-consul. Even the elders of the Jewish community urged her to convert to save herself, but she refused. She was beheaded in a public square in Fez to the joy of the spectators, who were mostly religious fanatics. The Jewish community paid for the retrieval of her corpse, her head, and the blood-stained earth for a Jewish burial at the Jewish cemetery. She was declared a martyr. The Jews called her Sol HaTzadikah, the righteous soul, and her grave became a site of pilgrimage. Oddly enough, Muslims also revere Sol. Her story caught the imagination of many painters and writers, and here is one by the French painter Alfred Dehodenc. Sol's headstone has inscriptions in Hebrew and French with different messages in each language. The French version goes like this. "Here lies Miss Solika Hatchwell, born in Tangier in 1817, refusing to enter into the Islamic religion. Arabs assassinated her in Fez in 1834, uprooting her from her family. The whole world regrets this saintly child." The Hebrew version is much milder. The gravestone of the righteous Solika Hachwell, a virgin maiden who greatly sanctified the name of heaven and died a martyr in the glorious city of Fez in the year 5594, that's 1834, and is buried here. May the Lord protect her. May her merit protect us. May it be God's will. We move on to this interesting case, the Jews of Togut. The forced conversion of the Jews of Togut on the edge of the Sahara Desert in present-day Algeria demonstrates how Jews could be the scapegoats of choice at a time of political crisis. The mid-19th century was a turbulent time for Algeria. The French had conquered the country in 1830, but were still facing stiff resistance from certain tribes. The Jews of Algeria were broadly in favor of the French conquest, but not all. Some supported the Emir Abdelkader and followed him into exile to the Levant. But those who mediated between the French and the Muslims were tarred with the brush of colonial complicity. The Jews of Togut were compelled to convert to Islam. Here is an account written in 1860 by James Bernard Ginsberg, a Jewish traveller who had converted to Protestantism. It was under the rule of one of the Qaids, that's a local commander who performed judicial and administrative functions, from the Ben Gilad family, that the Jews of Togut were persecuted. These Jews had been in the town in the Mazab on the edge of the Sahara since time immemorial and comprised half the population. They were ordered to convert to Islam or leave the town within 24 hours, abandoning their wives and children. Any Jew who failed to convert would have their head chopped off. It was Shavuot. Under the influence of Mahaya, that's alcohol, and the pitiless June heat, Ben Gilad would not be moved. Some Jews did escape within 24 hours and reverted to Judaism, abandoning their families and property. The rest chose to convert and are still followers of Muhammad. Most of the Marabout, that's the Muslim holy men, and their disciples descend from these renegades. They still carry Jewish names and live in a specific quarter. The insightful visitor would have no difficulty identifying Jewish faces. Despite the climate, the Jews are pale-skinned and easily distinguishable from the Moors and the Arabs, to say nothing of the blacks, although all are native to this region. The Jews of Togut complain bitterly of the treatment meted out to them since the arrival of the French in Algeria. They are oppressed by the Qaids, caliphs, and sheikhs. The reason for their persecution is the fact that the Jews serve as interpreters or mediators whenever a treaty is signed between the French and another region, city, or tribe. This creates hatred from the Muslims and more particularly the Berbers. The Jews formed a separate battalion to the Europeans, but their flashy uniforms only attracted attention, and they were attacked in 1871 by several hundred armed Muzabis and others. It was only when the French army intervened that a massacre was averted. The battalion was disbanded, but a simmering animosity between the two groups lingers on. The Jewish population lives constantly on its nerves, locked up in the ghetto at night and barely daring to venture out during the day. Simply seeing a few Arabs is enough to make them panic. End of quote. From Algeria, we travel to Central Asia. From this map, you can see that the Jews lived in a region that resembled the Pale of Settlement in Poland. The Jews moved around quite freely in this region. The Jewish triangle straddles Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. And it goes from Mashhad in the west to Tashkent in the northeast and south to Kabul. The shaded area is Bukhara, which became an emirate in the 18th century. And that's why you hear of Bukharan Jews. But Bukhara no longer exists. Today, it is part of Uzbekistan. In the Emirate of Bukhara, Jews were especially oppressed as dhimmis. They were forced to wear a yellow patch, identifying them as Jews, a special hat, and a belt made of rope. Leather belts were reserved for Muslims. Only a Jewish shopkeeper's head and shoulders should be visible to the street, demonstrating the Jews' subjugated status. Jewish homes had to be marked with a dirty cloth nailed to their front doors. When paying their annual jizya tax, Jewish men would be ritually slapped in the face by the Muslim authorities. Despite all this, the Jews earned a good living as peddlers and merchants. Towards the end of the 16th century, the Jews were confined to a ghetto or mahalla in the town of Bukhara. In the 18th century, the Muslims who were Sunnis forced conversion on as many as 1/3 of the Jews under threat of torture and execution. They were 13% of 300 families. That's out of about 1,500 people. These converts were called Chala, which is Tajik for neither this nor that. These Chala Jews married among themselves, and they lived in a neighborhood that bordered the Jewish quarter. The Jews would not marry them. They also faced prejudice from the Muslims. It was only when the region came under Russian rule in 1867 that Chalas were able to revert to Judaism. Today, there is no distinction between Bukharan Jews and Chalas. Those who had drifted towards Islam did not manage to revert to Judaism because apostasy is not permitted. 2 or 3 generations later, Chalas would begin to marry with the local Muslims and shed any remaining Jewish traditions. We now come to one of the most remarkable stories of forced conversion, how an entire community converted to Islam outwardly, but secretly maintained their Judaism. The Jews of Mashhad. Considered one of the holiest sites for Shiite Muslims, Mashhad, like Mecca and Medina today, did not allow Jewish settlement. It was a city of fundamentalist Islam, a city of pilgrimage, the site of the tomb of Imam Ali al-Rida, one of the 12 imams and a direct descendant of Muhammad. The first Jews arrived in the city at the invitation of Nader Shah, a ruler of Iran who was considered sympathetic to Jews. He sought to turn Mashhad into a commercial hub and made it his capital. However, by the time the Jews arrived, he had been assassinated, and they were allowed to settle only in a fenced-off area outside the city walls. For nearly a century, the Jews of Mashhad lived in a state of constant friction with their Shiite neighbors. The tension finally erupted into violence on the 10th day of Muharram in 1255 of the Islamic calendar. That's March the 26th, 1839. It came to be known as the Al-Adad incident. That day was part of the Ashura mourning ceremonies for Imam Hussein, during which Shiites self-flagellate to commemorate the murder of the Imam. On this day, a local Jewish woman suffering from a skin condition sought medical treatment. A doctor recommended she soak her hand in the blood of a slaughtered dog. She turned to a Muslim neighbor for help, but an argument over payment ensued. Seeking revenge, the neighbor spread a rumor that the Jews had slaughtered a dog while mockingly calling it Hussein, desecrating the Imam's honor and the sacred mourning rituals. The false accusation led to a massacre. Dozens of Jews were brutally murdered. Young Jewish girls were kidnapped and forcibly married to Muslims, and 2 were even wed to the local mufti. Jewish homes and businesses were looted and burnt. Of the dozens of Jewish-owned shops, only 4 remained intact. Religious texts were set aflame. Synagogues were ransacked, and the community's 7 Torah scrolls were seized by Shiite clerics. These scrolls were taken to the Imam Rida shrine and sealed in a basement behind bricks. And legend has it that the Torah scrolls remain hidden within the walls of the mosque to this day. The surviving Jews were rounded up and brought before the Mufti, who declared that the only way to escape total annihilation was to convert to Islam. After painful deliberation, the community leaders agreed to a forced conversion in name only in order to save their lives. As they recited the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, I bear witness that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger, some secretly substituted Muhammad's name with Moses, whispering Musa instead. Those who resisted conversion fled to Herat in present-day Afghanistan. 20 years later, they were taken prisoner for alleged treason by Persian troops. They were then marched 400 kilometers back to Mashhad. They were poorly fed and poorly dressed. They were incarcerated in a dilapidated caravanserai used by the military called Babar Khodrat, next to the Mashhad city walls. The Jews of Mashhad raised the money to free the imprisoned Jews. For over a century, the crypto-Jews of Mashhad lived under a veil of secrecy, knowing full well that discovery meant death. It was only when the first Shah became ruler of Iran that a more tolerant era began. Often experiencing terrible conditions, they remained confined to their quarter and continued to bury their dead in the Jewish cemetery, arguing that families should not be separated after death. The similarities between Judaism and Islam made it easier for these crypto-Jews to maintain their hidden Jewish identity. Certain practices like circumcision raised little suspicion as they were present in both religions. However, keeping kosher and observing Shabbat required elaborate deceptions. To dispel any doubts about their adherence to Islam, the Jews would purchase non-kosher meat in public, but secretly dispose of it by feeding it to stray animals or gifting it to Muslim servants. Kosher meat was obtained by discreetly slaughtering chickens and sheep, while larger animals like cattle were avoided, since kosher slaughtering practices would be too difficult to conceal. Outwardly, the Jews, known as New Muslims or Jadid al-Islam, were devout Muslims, fasting during Ramadan, attending prayers at the mosque, and dressing in traditional Muslim attire. Yet from birth, each child had two names, an official Muslim name and a secret Jewish name. Sometimes even close friends only learnt a person's Jewish identity in the days leading up to their burial. To avoid intermarriage with Muslims, the Jadid al-Islam often betrothed their young children to other children from within the community, sometimes before they were even 4 or 5 years old. This way, if a Muslim sought a Jewish girl for marriage, her family could claim she was already engaged. And by the age of 16, an unmarried girl was an old maid and at risk of being taken by a Muslim suitor. On Shabbat, shops remained open to maintain appearances, but young children were stationed at the counters, tasked with stalling customers by saying, "Father will be back soon," until the customers lost patience and left. Some shopkeepers went even further, wrapping their hands in bandages and claiming they were injured to avoid handling money. Even even prayer had to be conducted in secret. The new Muslims had secret synagogues in their homes, connected by underground passageways in case they needed to make a quick getaway. And worshippers gathered in private courtyards where children or elderly women were posted as lookouts to warn of approaching outsiders. To minimize suspicion, congregants did not exit together through the main door after prayers. Instead, they dispersed by climbing over walls and moving across rooftops to return to their homes unnoticed. This is a Ner Tamid dating back to 1886, the everlasting light that hangs in front of the ark in a synagogue. But it was actually a lantern with a copper base and a top that could be closed to resemble a simple box. And the inscription shows it was dedicated by Karbala Reza Gholam in 1886. A converted Jew who was forced to prove his faith by going on pilgrimage to the grave of Imam Hussein in Karbala, Iraq. No such light existed in mosques, but you can see that it can be concertinaed back to be concealed from any prying strangers. They had two marriage contracts or ketubot. The one on the left is in Hebrew, and the one on the right is the Muslim one. And this is the ketubah of Bathsheba, daughter of Moshe, who was 13 at the time of her marriage to Yaqub, son of Abraham. And here you see on the left the Muslim ketubah, very ornate, and the much simpler Jewish ketubah. So here is a box containing the weekly Torah portions or parashiot. It was made in Lithuania in 1900, and it contains 54 booklets, one for each weekly Torah portion. It resembles the Muslim custom of separately binding individual chapters of the Quran and reading them on special occasions. Converts continued to use Hebrew or Jadid, their own Judeo-Farsi language, written in Hebrew Rashi script. And perhaps the most striking artifact from the community is an illustrated Quran that once belonged to the Hakimian family. Due to their high status, the family had to maintain an especially devout Muslim front, and within the margins, they recorded dates of births and deaths. And they have now donated this book to the National Library of Israel. It was down to the women to preserve Judaism in the home. The men were often absent, traveling for weeks, months, or even years. And this is a pendant that might have been worn by a Jewish woman to prove that she was actually Muslim. Rachel Friedman gave my organization, Harif, a talk about the Mashhadi Jews. She belonged to a family that remained secret Jews for 5 generations. Her great grandmother was a hairdresser and a beautician who visited women in their homes and instructed them in Torah and Halakha, Jewish law. The women would sit outside the converts' mosques. They were like a living barrier, preventing Muslims from entering the mosque since the Muslims had to avoid contact with women. Like the Anusim of Spain, it was the women of the community who became the primary guardians of Jewish life in Mashhad. Beneath their chador, the Muslim garment that covered their entire bodies and concealed their identities, they became the community's covert smugglers. Hidden within their robes, they transported packages of kosher meat, religious artifacts, and even small Torah scrolls. Observance of Jewish laws within the home rested largely in their hands. They also oversaw the Jewish burial rites. Outwardly, the dead were wrapped in seamless Muslim burial shrouds, but when possible, Jewish men were secretly dressed in their prayer shawls beneath the outer garments. This is an account of a funeral. A funeral procession winds around the mosque in Mashhad, Iran. Mourners wail over the deceased when suddenly government officials burst into the ceremony. A Muslim woman loudly accuses the Jadid al-Islam of wrapping the body in Jewish burial shrouds instead of following Islamic customs. Panic spreads. Most mourners scatter, fearing for their lives. Practicing Judaism in secret is a crime punishable by death. Meanwhile, the argument between the grieving family and the officers intensifies until the police demand, "Enough talking, let a woman inspect the shrouds and settle the matter." From the back of the crowd, an elderly woman steps forward. She is the wife of a respected Muslim man. The leaders of the Jadid community hold their breath, knowing that the shrouds were indeed prepared according to Jewish tradition and that a single glance could expose them. The elderly woman curses the Jadid al-Islam loudly, calling them faithless Muslims who are secretly Jews. She leans over the body, examines the shrouds, and then, with audible disappointment, announces that they are perfectly in line with Islamic law. A sigh of relief sweeps through the community. This time they are safe. The deceased is buried with full Muslim rites. Later, away from prying eyes, the burial is completed according to Jewish tradition as well. That elderly woman named Johar was herself a Jewish woman who had converted to Islam. After her Muslim husband's death, she returned to Judaism, immigrated to the land of Israel, lived in the Bukharan quarter of Jerusalem, and was buried on the Mount of Olives in 1911. Some of the Jews undertook the Hajj to reinforce their cover. This was the pilgrimage to Mecca. And when they got back, they were honored with the title Haji. Yet, even on the pilgrimage, they found ways to maintain their Jewish faith. And this is a mini tefillin that was concealed inside the turban of a Hajj. Some members of the community used the journey to Mecca as an opportunity to break away from their Muslim escorts and travel to Jerusalem. Here's another picture. showing that some of the Mashhadis were still in traditional dress, while others had adopted more modern clothing by the turn of the 20th century. Now, this is a synagogue in Jerusalem that was founded by Haji Adonia HaKohen. He built the first Mashhadi Jewish synagogue in Jerusalem, and he was a Haji. In other words, he'd been on pilgrimage to Mecca. Beginning in the early 20th century, waves of Mashhadi Jews immigrated through Damascus to the land of Israel. But even in their new homeland, they faced skepticism and challenges, despite being very observant and despite their communal ties, they were met with suspicion by some of the Jewish leadership. Rabbi Yitzhak Halevi Herzog, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Mandatory Palestine, doubted whether they were truly Jewish. He was concerned about intermarriage with non-Jews and also the issue of illegitimate children. The Mashhadi Jews, feeling deeply insulted, turned to their global community for support, and they petitioned Rabbi Ben Zion Meir Hai Uziel, the Sephardi chief rabbi of Palestine, to advocate on their behalf. He attested to their unwavering Jewish faith. And eventually, Rabbi Herzog accepted his testimony, and the Mashhadi Jews were officially recognized as part of the Jewish people. Now, all the while they had lived in Mashhad, they had maintained their Judaism despite the constant threat of pogroms, especially at Pesach. The Jews paid bribes to the authorities, to the imams and the police. There was a constant threat of raids into their homes to find wine. On one occasion, Rachel Friedman recounts that the family had been reciting Kiddush over wine when the police burst in. The mother of the house quickly poured the wine into a bucket and hid the bottle in the baby's crib. Ironically, her descendant is Matt Haruni, who founded the Dalton Winery in the Galilee in Israel. And here he is with his winemaker on the left and his son Alex on the right. This, in case you happen to be in Neve Tzedek in Tel Aviv, this is a plaque on a wall to the Mother's House. That is an old age home for elderly ladies of the Mashhadi community. And that is in Tel Aviv. We move on to another country, and that is Yemen. The Jews of Yemen had been subject to forced conversions throughout their ancient history. The Zaydis, a Shiite sect who ruled from medieval times, treated the Jews particularly harshly, and tens of thousands are believed to have converted to Islam over the centuries. In the early 20th century, Imam Yahya reinstated many Zaydi laws that had not been enforced during the period of Ottoman rule. And among the laws was one that required the imamate to take custody of orphaned Jewish children and convert them to Islam. And this was called the Orphans' Decree. There was also pressure from a visiting delegation of Palestinian Arabs in 1922 to reinstate this decree. And even children who had lost only one parent were targeted for conversion. It is thought that a Jewish boy forcibly taken from his family became president. Zechariah Haddad was kidnapped as a young boy, forced to convert to Islam and given the name Abdul Rahman Yahya al-Iriani before being appointed the president of the Yemen Arab Republic, that's North Yemen, in 1967. His term lasted for 6.5 years. The orphans' decree forced the Jewish community to begin smuggling children to Aden. This port city had been a British protectorate since 1839. In Aden, the Jews were thought to be safe. The decree also forced the Jewish community into marrying off children as young as 12 years old to avoid the decree. Often an aunt or other relative would take in the orphan and bring him up as her own. A woman called Bracha told the following story. Her father did business by trading goods between Aden and Yemen. He had donkeys with panniers on either side. He would pick up the Jewish orphans and place them on either side of the donkeys and carry them back to Aden. He did not attract suspicion as he prayed with the Muslims as if he was one of them. The historian S.D. Goiten argues that the orphans' decree in Yemen was one of the main reasons why the Jews of Yemen wanted to leave the country, and about 55,000 Jews were airlifted to Israel in 1949. My last case of forced conversion concerns the Kurdish Jews. The abduction of Jewish women and children went on throughout history under Islam. It's something of a dirty little secret. In Kurdistan, the tribal chieftains often treated Jews as their chattels. I was amazed at a Kurdish meeting that everyone told me that they had Jewish grandmothers. How could that be? It could only be through the kidnapping of Jewish women and their forcible conversion to Islam. A story doing the rounds in Israel a few years ago tells that a military advisor was sent by the Israeli army to train the Kurds in the 1960s. He wrote that when he was invited one evening for a dinner at a Kurdish Peshmerga army leader's house, a lady in that house brought him tea. When he looked at her, he thought he recognized her and asked if she was Sarah. When she heard him calling her that name, she dropped the tray with all the tea on the floor out of shock and rushed out of the room. He never saw her again. He added that when his family lived in northern Iraq, he had a sister by the name of Sarah who was kidnapped. He was sure that that lady was his sister. There are other cases of forced conversion I won't have time to go into. And there is the case of the followers of the false Messiah Shabbatai Tzvi in the Ottoman Empire who converted to Islam. However, I don't think that their conversion was entirely forced. So with that, I'll finish. Very happy to answer any questions if I can. Trying to find the questions, just a sec.
Thank you, Lyn. Let me know if you need any assistance.
Right,
You're going to look right down at the bottom of your Zoom navigation bar for that little question mark box.
Yeah, end of slideshow. Oh, yeah, okay. So,
and then down at the bottom.
Right, where it says more? Is that right?
If you're not seeing a box with a question mark, then maybe you do need to click on more. It should be just there.
Yeah, Q&A. Yes,
Yeah.
I've got it, I think. Okay. So Shelley Shapiro asks, what do you mean converting for increased inheritance rights? Well, what happened was the Muslim was entitled to inherit more than the non-Muslim. He might have been able to inherit maybe twice what the non-Muslim inherited. Uh, yes, Adrian Wolf, I actually I did talk at length about the Mashhadi community. And we have somebody called Sol, and she comes from the Benzaken family, born in Tetuan. And sorry, she wasn't called Sol, it was her mother was called Sol. And she was named after Sol Hatzadika. Wonderful. Arlene Goldberg. She'd been taught that Jews in Muslim areas were better treated than those in Europe. Doesn't seem that life for Jews was much better than in Europe. I'm afraid you're right there. Thank you, Stu. Thank you, Rhonda. There's a community of Adeni Jews in North London. Yeah, absolutely. The Aden community actually left more or less in 1948 because there was a massacre. About 87 Jews died then. Most of them went to Israel, but as you say, there is a community of Adeni Jews in North London, but that doesn't have much to do with forced conversion. And Roger says, I've never heard of forced conversion from another religion to Judaism. Oh, that happens all the time. Although Judaism does discourage proselytizing. Sherry Shapiro, can you recommend a book about this history? I'm afraid there isn't a particular book. I've got information, in sort of dribs and drabs. I consulted Martin Gilbert's book, In Ishmael's House. I read articles. I read articles. I read a book in French called Exile from the Maghreb. But I'm sorry, there isn't any particular book you could consult. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Mimi. Thank you, Barbara. Um, is that it?
I think so. That's all I'm
Yeah.
seeing as well.
Okay. Think
Thank
people
you
are.
so much for being with us today.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for listening. Have a
Yeah.
good evening.
Have a good evening, everyone.